Great. That's a really good question, Dar. Um, I don't know. Maybe it's because a gender term denotes difference, which is not a bad thing. But again, I think you know what, that would be a really good discussion when we have it on the porch too. But I do agree with you, and maybe we'll get to the point where we don't have to have that gendered term. Can I go on, or were there any other questions? Okay. All right. So if this is what feminism means, then feminism is really this radical notion that that women are people. So why is it that people think that this, she, represents all feminists? And this is actually the crux of my talk. I went through and did a kind of a historical data dive to really find out this answer. And like I said again, I have no idea how these slides are ordered, so I'm just going to swing by the hip, okay? The look on her face. So remember when, historically, women couldn't vote and they couldn't own property and they weren't allowed even to have certain kinds of education because that just wasn't ladylike? It wasn't until 1849, when California became the first state to allow women to own property. Now, keep in mind that the Constitution was signed in 1787, 62 years before it crossed anybody's mind that a woman should have the same right to own property like men. But what's crazy about that is it wasn't until 10 years later, 1857, when it was actually accepted by the nation to allow women to own property. But there's a catch. If you got married, your property rights now belong to your husband. Isn't that crazy? It wasn't until, and here's the other thing, so you can own land, you pay property taxes, but you can't vote. And you weren't allowed full voting rights until 1920. 1920, thanks to the 19th Amendment. What's interesting, and hopefully that slide will come up, is that the 15th Amendment let everyone vote but women. So the reason why we can vote and own property is because of America's first historical feminist, Susan B. Anthony. In 1872, the Fifth Amendment had already been ratified, and she decided, and I'll show you the terminology in a minute, that she was going to exercise her rights under the 15th Amendment and vote, because that's what the 15th Amendment was. It was to vote. But she found out that amendment had nothing to do for women. She got arrested for trying to cast her ballot. And I think some of the saddest stuff is you notice that she passed away in 1906. So when she passed away, women still were not allowed to vote. But she started a lot of the feminist movements in the United States. Now take a look at the 15th Amendment. It says here, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States by any state on account of, and I highlighted this, race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Former slaves were allowed to vote. Here it says any race or color is allowed to vote. But what they didn't say is the second piece. The Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. In other words, anybody of any race, color, or previous condition of solitude can vote as long as you're not a woman. Because if you are, we're going to arrest you. So at the end, women were not allowed to vote, but they still had to pay taxes. How fair is that? So one thing I wanted to bring up here, and I went on this site called I Don't Need Feminism. It's a very interesting site, and I pulled this out. If people say they don't need feminism, it usually means one of two things. Either they really don't understand what feminism actually means, which is equal rights for everyone, or They actually believe that it's perfectly okay to deny rights to certain human beings based on gender. That's really it. So I took this picture because you can see it. She says here, I don't believe in feminism because I believe in equity, not entitlements and supremacy. I'm like, really? Okay. Yeah. So, going on, are there any questions so far that I can answer for anybody? Just a little bit, huh? So, like I said, I still wanted to know why, you have that assumption. And so, what I did is I started looking at the origins of feminism itself. And I asked Dr. Fran how to pronounce this, so I'm hoping I'm going to pronounce it right. But the original idea behind women's emancipation started in the 1830s in France, which, gosh, there's so many neat things that come out of France. So the term is, and I'm hoping I'm going to pronounce this right, féminisme. In his writing, this term wasn't mentioned by Charles Fourier, but the idea of women's emancipation came out. No, but okay, I'm sorry, Dr. Fran. You can tell me later. So, after the 1830s came the feminists. And again, I'm really sorry about the butchering here. So, although Fourier may have introduced the concept, it wasn't until 1880 before self-proclaimed feminist Aubertine Auclair began to use her word in the journal La Citoyenne. The term took off in 1892 when Eugène Pontoni-Pierre declared solidarity through the first proclaimed feminist congress in Paris. And what's interesting is from 1830, when the concept began, it wasn't until the 1890s when it started to spread, the concept started to spread throughout the world. And the U.S. was one of the last countries, actually, to catch on to this term feminist. But by 1910, it was used to address women's suffrage. So what's interesting about this is as soon as the term came out in 1910, when people started to hear feminist, they started to try and define themselves for themselves. In other words, what were the things they were fighting for? And several views came out about feminism. And unfortunately, what happened is when one group would define themselves in one way, I'm a socialist feminist, another group would say, well, you're not really truly a feminist because you don't believe in X, Y, and Z. I'm a bourgeoisie feminist, and this is what it really should be. Or another person would say, I'm a matriarchal feminist or a radical feminist. And so what's interesting is as soon as this came out, there was a lot of debate about what not only feminism was, but what a woman's roles should be. And those even now to this day have been argued. So feminism really diverged from this textbook definition of equity to encompass a wide range of views on women's rights, suffrage, activism, and all sorts of other things. In some ways, I'd almost call it like a Pandora's box. We have this term that identifies something that's very important to us. But how is it expressed? How is it lived? And how is it acted upon? Because it's supposed to encompass all of these things that people believed in. So the term, which was supposed to mean equity for men and women, like I said, became an F word, where people used it to divide and fight to win instead of listen and understand. Are there any questions so far that I can answer for you, or should we go on? Okay. So feminism became a historically sensitive word because there was so much to say and people were struggling to figure out how to say it. And I would say that's still the case. And part of it, and again, we can save this discussion for a different time, going back to Starr's metaphor of salt and pepper, if you live in a world where everything is compared to pepper, it's really hard to figure out what the nature of salt really is. So, two modes of feminism have historically clashed. And again, keep in mind that there's so many different divergent types of feminists out there. And actually, these two sources, you see 2 and 3, which are on your note card, these two sources really tried to explain and figure out the same question that I had been pursuing, which is, well, how is it that the word feminism has this negative stigma? And so what they tried to do is they said, well, in general, feminism tends to fall between two very general camps. The first is a relational feminist, which is basically the dominant form of feminism before the 1800s. And what this was is women's rights that acknowledge their contributions to society in relation to everyone. In other words, the family woman, the woman that wants to cook, she wants a family, she wants these particular roles, and she's very proud of those roles. Her fighting has to do with, I want to vote, I pay taxes, and I want to be treated as an equal, and I want to be acknowledged for the roles that I do. Being a mother should be just as valid as, you know, a male being an engineer and going out to work. At the same time, being somebody that goes to work, being a scientist, a female scientist, should also have the same validity as a male scientist. Now, the individualist feminist arose after the 1900s and onwards, especially their voices were the loudest in the 1990s. The individualist feminists took on this belief that women are individual and autonomous, and a lot of individualists take on the role of resistance, renouncing traditional women's roles as being socially defined and trying to really, I would say, really break out of the mold of what they thought female was, because they believed that female, in this case, was a male-defined definition, and they wanted to be as far away with that as they could. Now, what I'm describing here is a range, right? So you've got the relational and you've got the individualist on these two very, very far spectrums. And this is still, I'm sure, as you know, an argument even to this day. But, you know, what I would argue is that, you know, you can be both. If you're into gender equity, you're a feminist, and that's okay. The kind of feminist you are, the kind of beliefs that you believe in, it's perfectly fine, and you could fall into any one of these ranges. But it was because of the relational and individualist feminists that we actually have some of the issues that we have today. When relational feminists disagreed with individualist feminists, they would renounce each other. And then that's how we got the birth, and you see this now, of the term anti-feminist, which, gosh, we see this all over the media these days.